James Glasnapp is the most amazing person I've ever met, and I just met him recently. I still have that glow from the first contact. And Ellen Isaacs and James are both doing a home team advantage. They're in the CSL lab here, the Ethnographic Practices Group, Services Group. Without further ado,
wow, what an introduction, Paul. Paul said, how do you want me to introduce you? I said, I want you to introduce me as the most fabulous person you've ever met. And he actually did. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Paul, for inviting us. It's a pleasure for Ellen and I to come and talk about a project we've really enjoyed working on this year. And so today we're going to tell you about an ethnographic project we did around parking. And we're going to talk a little bit about a shorter ethnographic method we developed at Park recently that focuses on a shorter timeline. But first, I want to set the tone. I've heard a lot of people came tonight because they're interested in the topic of parking, and I want to set the tone by playing a short clip from the movie Fried Green Tomatoes, which I think we all can relate to.
Out here all day.
If I can show
Excuse me, I was waiting for that space.
Yeah? Tough. Face it, lady, we're younger and faster.
Towanda. Girls, I'm older and I have more insurance.
So, I mean, parking is something we all have a lot of experience with, and I think one of the pleasures of working on this particular subject is that we didn't have any problem talking to people as we approached them around parking, and it was really fun to observe. So, with that, I'm going to give a brief History 101 of parking, just to kind of give you the history. So the first parking meter was developed in 1935 in Oklahoma City, and as you can see, it looks relatively similar to the parking meter of today. It was developed by an inventor called Carl McGee, and he was responding to increasing congestion in Oklahoma City, and a lot of people were purchasing cars, and downtown was becoming quite congested. Merchants were wanting to come up with some way of getting cars to move. And so he developed something that would, force this, and he called it the parkometer. We have a video clip that we want to play that we found that will give us the experience of what it was like in Oklahoma City, and also shows the reaction of residents to parking.
The first parking meter was installed on an Oklahoma City street on July 16, 1935. It was invented by Carl McGee, a local attorney, and newspaper editor. Traffic in downtown Oklahoma City had become a problem. A committee was formed to study what could be done to deal with it, and McGee's Parkometer was the solution. These newsreel scenes demonstrate how the strange new device was viewed by the public. The first parking meter on Main Street, Oklahoma City.
Interesting. So there was a lot of just incremental innovation in parking over the last 40 years. Of course, at first they accepted coins. The meters moved to a digital display. Then we have the big dual head display. They now accept credit cards. Many are solar powered. And of course, we've had kiosks since the 80s, but these are coming increasingly popular among cities because the cost of implementing them is less. The problem, of course, with these kiosks is that it puts the onus on the user to find where the kiosk is, walk to the kiosk, and if it's a pay and display system such as this is, you've got to go back to your car and display it, and many people don't like this. Or you have to find the number, remember the number, and input it on the kiosk. Cities like this because they increase revenue. And the other downside for us as parkers is that we no longer can pull into a spot and get the delight of seeing 15 minutes or 20 minutes on the meter. With these kiosks, of course, we pay for the full time that we park. It's estimated that a large percentage of congestion is caused by people looking for parking. I think we can all relate to this when we follow people who are very obviously looking for parking and they're driving at 5 to 10 miles an hour, and it's very frustrating. And so many cities are looking for ways to decrease congestion. Donald Chup is a premier expert on parking. He's written a book called The High Cost of Free Parking, and he is arguing that the cost of parking should actually be seen by the parker themselves. He says that 99% of parking is actually free to the parker, but in fact it's not free. It's paid for by developers, so we don't actually realize the cost of parking and its great toll on the cities, the economy, and the environment. This crazy list, this crazy long list, is parking space requirements for an urban city, and every type of building has a required number of spots that has to be associated depending on what type of use you have for the building. And this causes a lot of problems. For example, if the building use changes, the new tenant may not have enough parking spots, or they may have way too many, depending on the zones. So what does this cause? This is New Orleans, and as you can see, it causes urban sprawl. Roughly, visually, you can see that 50% here of what you see is parking. And this is a problem. So there's a lot of current innovation going on around the world in parking, from France to New Zealand to Australia to here in the States. And it has largely to do with parking spot sensors, putting networked sensors underneath the parking spot, and what we're calling supply and demand-based pricing, which means that the price of the parking spot will change depending on the time of day and the actual demand for that spot. Cities are also trying to make parking easier by providing applications on the phone to allow people to view things such as available parking spots and pay for parking as well. So this is a promotional video from San Francisco's program SF Park, which paints a very idyllic view of what this future will be like.
Here's how it works. Newly installed parking sensors detect when a parking space is available. Drivers will be able to check parking availability and rates online, by text message, and by smartphone before heading to their destination. This will help people decide whether to drive, take public transit, bike, or walk. When people choose to drive, new SF park meters will make paying easier. In addition to taking coins, the new meters will accept credit cards and SF MTA parking cards. Parking time limits will be extended. Easier payment and extended time limits will help drivers avoid tickets.
So at Park, since we're trying to take this one step further and develop, parking of the future, we really want to make sure that these systems are user-centered and have a place for that the user can make sense of it. All of this talk of demand-based pricing and sensors has really reached kind of the public sector in terms of cartoons. So I think the LA Times printed this. LA will test new parking meters that can change rates from day to day depending on demand. So in the not so distant future, we'll have meters that can scan a registration sticker of a car to gauge how much someone can afford. So obviously if you're driving a slick sports car, you'd be charged more than if you're driving an older jalopy. That, in the future, meters will be able to gauge the desperation of parkers, so that if you're really late for a meeting and look very, haggard, you'll be charged more. And an entirely new set of consumer devices will be developed to trick these meters into thinking it's a different day, or that it's raining, or that you're in a different location, which is quite funny.
So I'm going to talk a little now about the project, the work that we did on this study. So we are working with a team here at Park that's trying to think about, okay, well, once all the meters are all networked and they're run by a server, what more can you do? How can you push this further? And one of the ideas that the team had was, well, what if you could reserve on-street parking? Would that be useful? That might help reduce congestion, because then people could just go straight to the parking spot, and it might help people plan their outings better, because then they'll reserve the parking, they'll go when they have reserved parking. So they asked James and I to do some ethnographic observations, go out to the cities, hang out on street corners, check out parking, to inform this concept, but also in general to get a broader sense of, well, what are some of the human considerations when you're designing a next generation parking system. So let me just give you a sense of the structure. So this was the parking project here at Park. We were the ethnographers within it. We were doing it for a client, ACS. They're a large company. They do all the back-end processing of parking tickets and parking meters. And they do that on behalf of a lot of cities around the United States, and now starting to go international. So this is a picture from their New Orleans office. You can see they have a nice view of the Superdome there. And these folks were opening parking when you write your check and you send off, and people like them are opening it up and keeping track of who's paid for what, and they do that on behalf of the city. So we started out, we just did 3 local observations in this area, and then eventually we ended up doing that observation in New Orleans, which is an interesting story I'll get to later about how that came about. Okay, so in doing this project, we did it as we were testing out or developing a different sort of technique for doing ethnographic observations that we're calling REACT, for Rapid Ethnographic Assessment and Communication Technique. And we developed this in response to clients who are increasingly asking us to come. They want us to do shorter engagements that are less expensive, but of course they still want to get those insights that will have real impact on their projects. And I imagine that many of you here, even if you're not working with clients, are still internal clients asking you to do things faster, cheaper, get results quicker. So this was our attempt at trying to, what could we do to modify our standard process to get results quicker? So we modified our process in 2 main ways, and I'll talk mostly about the second one. But in the first part of the phase, the first couple phases, what we do is we instead of trying to get a broad or an in-depth understanding of like a whole domain, we try to narrow the focus to something very specific that the client is looking to learn more about. So in this case, the on-street reservations. And then we go out with multiple observers and we do iterative observations. So we both go out, we get different points of view, we come back, we evaluate what we've learned, go back out and refine our understanding. And we try to stay focused on looking at things that have real opportunity for technology design. We also place an emphasis on collecting a lot of media, video, photos, audio, because for the second part of it, which is in how we communicate the results to our clients. So that's the other part of it that we really tried to focus on, was how we share our results with clients. So because we feel like we do a lot of work, we come up with really interesting insights, and we don't always have the impact that we would really like with the client for various reasons. We write these whole reports up at the end, we make presentations and slides, we send them around, and then they don't always necessarily get read, fully by the people who really should be reading them or who would benefit from them. When our typical thing is at the end of an engagement, the client will come, we'll have a full day or sometimes multi-day workshop where we show them video. We do a lot of video work. And so we're all in a room, we're spending this time looking at many of the video clips and really absorbing and coming to really understand what the insights were, what the findings were, and what the implications are. And we really try to make it engaging for people. Here we're doing sort of a little icebreaker bonding activity called the Marshmallow Challenge, where you have to build as tall a structure as you can with a spaghetti, tape, string, and a marshmallow has to be up on the top. And here, James is measuring the height of it. This works really well. If you're interested, you should go to marshmallowchallenge.com. It tells you all about it. And these work great. I mean, at the end of the sessions, we feel like the client really has come to understand and they get a lot out of it. But then they go back to their company and they have to now communicate that to the larger organization. And it's difficult when so much of that was absorbing the video and understanding the meaning of that. So we had a really nice project last year with a client in Japan where it was sort of an ideal arrangement where we had a shared server that we all had access to. It had all the data for the study, all the video, sort of the best case. And even then, a month after it was over, our client there contacted us and said, one of the materials is missing from the server. Could you please upload it again for me? So just trying to share video can be difficult. And then even for the group that was involved in the workshop, things change, new people come in, and now that person hasn't experienced the whole workshop. So they don't, for these reasons and others, it just, over time, the effect of the results just kind of diminishes over time. So we thought, well, how can we make better use? How can we mitigate that? And we thought, well, why don't we take advantage of the fact that people are now really used to watching little short videos, not just for entertainment, but also for work. So what if we could package up our findings and create short, entertaining video podcasts that tell the story of our findings, and then people could watch them on their own time whenever they wanted, and then they could propagate them, and they could forward them on to others, and they could still last over time, and we wouldn't necessarily have to have the whole workshop at the end. It could be communicated in this way. So that was our approach. And so for each time we did one of the observations, we created a podcast, we put it up on Vimeo with a password, we sent it around, and that's how we communicated the results. So I'm just going to give you a quick summary of some of the things we did with these podcasts, and then we're going to show you a whole series of clips and give you a sense of the parking outcomes. So we made use of, obviously, a lot of the video that we captured while we were out doing our observations are part of it, that you'll see this video in the clip. We also have lots and lots of pictures, and sometimes we draw these diagrams on them and use these, use these text banners there to sort of reinforce the points that we're making. We create a lot of these maps. This is showing the 4 zones in Palo Alto where you can park for 2 hours and then you have to move somewhere within those zones. This chart was done by the researchers. They had taken the ACS data of all the parking citations in San Francisco and done an analysis of it and laid it out on a map to show where the citations tend to be. And so that informed our observations. We went mainly to those neighborhoods that are problematic. Some cases we don't have video, we just audio recorded interviews, and so we spoke to this waiter in New Orleans, so we play the audio with the picture. And then we did this kind of text. Sometimes we summarize what we're saying in text, and every now and then when we sort of have a thought or an idea of something that could be generated from it, we represent it this way. And you'll see all of them in these. So we did 4 podcasts, one for each of the cities we did, and we started out, the first one from Oakland was pretty basic. It was basically just a slide set with a voiceover. So just watching it was like watching a bunch of, listening to a slide presentation being given. But then we got a little more sophisticated and we started adding some of these features that I talked about and some music and transitions and things, and you'll see the progression.
So this first clip is from that podcast in Oakland. And the research team had a hypothesis that we were looking at reserved on-street parking, and so we thought that shoppers and diners would be excellent candidates for this. But in Oakland, we found that there was plenty of parking, but to our surprise, we found another type of individual that would be ideal for reserving on-street parking.
So if this initial visit is representative of Oakland, we think it may not have a compelling need for reserved parking.
However, we did encounter one type of person who may benefit from being able to reserve on-street parking: low-wage employees whose employers don't provide parking. The woman in this picture worked at the Marriott Hotel just across the street, and we saw her rush out to pay for another 2 hours of parking. We stopped to chat with her and learned that she works part-time in 4 to 5 hour shifts. There's a garage across the street that offers low early bird rates, but since her shifts usually start later, she can't take advantage of it.
So in this next clip, we hear from a merchant in New Orleans. We were also interested in whether merchants in general would be interested in validating parking for their patrons. So in a scenario where a parking system is networked, for example, a diner would pay for parking with their credit card, and if they use the same credit card at a restaurant, the restaurant could validate the parking would recognize the credit card, and for example, you might get a text message saying that, $2 have now come off your parking. And we hear here that they were very interested in something like validating parking, but had not come up with something that had been successful thus far.
So instead, if someone asks about parking when making a reservation, they'll deduct $5 from their bill. This gets a little complicated though if more than one person in the party parked a car. Let's listen to what he had to say.
They looked into doing valet parking here, and it wasn't feasible for them. Plus, the valet had nowhere to put cars because the lots. They're like they don't care. They don't want to make a deal with anybody because they got a great business.
The idea there being that maybe they could use the on-street reservations. Someone could reserve on-street, and then that could be treated as validation because then when they paid with a credit card, they would get deducted from the bill. Okay, so then once we were out, we started realizing that if there's more of value, not just in changing, once everything is networked, beyond changing the prices, you could also change the policy of parking spots. And we saw a lot of need for wanting to be able to change the policy of spots. So in this clip from San Francisco, you see there's places where there's loading zones where there's nobody parked, and then there's general parking where there's not nearly enough parking. And even when they try to sort of timeshare spots where it's loading in the morning and general parking in the afternoon, it doesn't work that well because people can't tell that the policy has changed. So maybe there's a real opportunity here to be able to modify who's allowed to park when at different times of day.
We saw a variety of situations where it was difficult to balance the needs of different constituents, and everyone's needs could be better met if the city could adjust parking policies more fluidly. One example of this involved balancing the needs of trucks that need to load and unload with the needs of the general public that wants to go shopping or run errands.
As you see in this video from the downtown area near Union Square, nearly the whole area is allocated to loading, making it nearly impossible for shoppers to park on the street, even though there were many loading spaces available. A parking officer that we spoke to said that they had requested more general parking spots because the balance was so far in favor of loading.
So it's a little bizarre because all of these are yellow.
Yeah, these are all.
So there is really no
place for regular people to park. Are we sure? So yeah, we're sure that there's white.
In Pacific Heights, where the parking along Fillmore Street is often at full capacity, as you see here, The city has tried to timeshare spots by reserving them for loading in the morning and opening them up for general parking after 12 noon. But since both the curbs and the meters are clearly marked yellow, it's difficult to tell when the spaces become available for general parking, and the only way to know is by reading a sticker wrapped around the pole.
We spoke to this woman who, having learned about this shift, regularly times her visits to arrive shortly after noon. She said the spot she uses is almost always available, probably because most people don't realize it's no longer a loading zone.
Other times, parking spaces need to be temporarily restricted for several days or weeks to accommodate construction and other projects. The city handles this by posting temporary signs that are filled in by hand, and these are hard to read from the car as you drive by. We have seen these spots vacant during times when it is actually available to park for the general public.
Once again, we saw the problem of using painted curbs to indicate parking restrictions. While they're easily visible, they're also hard to change as policies change. We pulled into this spot that was painted white, indicating passenger loading, but it also had a meter suggesting that it was available for parking. We happened to see a parking officer who told us it used to be a loading zone, but was now a regular spot. But if we hadn't run into him, we would have been unsure about parking there.
Finally, this smart car parked in Pacific Heights illustrates a different type of dynamic parking issue. As you can see, the car took up only about a third of a spot, leaving plenty of open space that could potentially be used by other vehicles. On the other hand, an Arrowhead delivery truck took up 1.5 spots. If the size of the parking spots could be dynamically adjusted depending on the size of the vehicle parking, more cars could fit on the street.
These different examples made us think it would be useful if the meters, and maybe even the curbs, could dynamically change their color based on time of day or parking conditions. Perhaps the tops of the meters could be lit up in different colors rather than painted permanently, and maybe even color could be projected onto the curb somehow rather than painted on.
So then I'm just going to show this next clip is we sort of continue with that thought in the New Orleans podcast, and we did a little diagram or a little animation to show that idea.
What's needed is a method for marking the spots in an easily recognizable way that can also be modified on a per day or even per hour basis. For example, a spot could be marked for loading in the morning and parking in the afternoon, and the next day not allow any stopping because of a special event.
We're a little dubious about the idea of projecting color onto the curbs, but the idea was to get their ideas, get the mind thinking about other ways that you could communicate these policies. And so then we did our last observation in New Orleans, and we found that there were a lot of different reasons why you want to be able to change parking for different, on an hourly basis. They seemed particularly the case in New Orleans.
One of the main things that struck us about New Orleans is that it hosts many special events throughout the year, which has a real effect on parking. Of course, there's Mardi Gras, which involves many parades over a couple of weeks, but there are numerous other parades. As one resident put it, there's a parade here for everything, including Halloween, Christmas, Mother's Day, St. Patrick's Day, and more. Parades are common enough that there are permanent signs restricting parking 2 hours before any parade.
We saw this sign listing 14 special event dates just from July to January, and while we were there, people were setting up bleachers like these along St. Charles Avenue, a main thoroughfare in the Central Business District, which will take several blocks of parking out of commission for a few weeks.
There are also other types of events. The Sunday we were there, the city hosted the Rock and Roll Marathon, which meant closing off some main streets for half a day. We also saw 4 different areas that had temporary signs restricting parking because of filming.
And since the Superdome is in the Central Business District, there are frequent events that attract as many as 75,000 people, which may explain the vast amount of space allocated to parking lots in the nearby area.
Some of these events have indirect effects on parking, as we learned when we walked by Lucy's restaurant in the Central Business District on Friday morning and noticed barriers taking over several parking spots. They told us the place gets so busy in the evenings that the crowd flows out into the street, so the city requires them to buy permits to block off the street to accommodate the crowd.
Not only is it difficult for drivers to see and understand temporary signs while driving, but putting them up also requires a lot of time and effort, and then of course they need to be removed after the event. This man was walking along the marathon route after it was over, taking down each sign one at a time, but this temporary sign for filming hadn't been removed a week after it had expired.
So, how many of you think you're fluent in the language of parking color? Okay, so are you fluent in like San Francisco parking color, or are you fluent like across the country? California. So what, does anyone want to take a guess at any one of these? Red is no parking. Yellow is loading zone. Handicapped. More or less, white no one knows. That's airport talk. So this use of color is really interesting because we don't really realize that we have our own preconceptions of what our understanding of what the color is, but that it changes almost from state to state, and so it's not standardized. And that we need to do more than just convey what a color means, but also maybe use symbols. We're starting to do this when we're designing the next generation of meters in a simple way that not only conveys a color, but what the meaning behind that color is. So that's interesting. In this next video, we'll see that people really still don't understand the meaning of color as they approach some of these signs.
Parking policies. The brightly colored meters are easy to spot from the street, but it's not obvious to everyone what they mean. The meters in loading zones were particularly confusing.
As you'll see in this next video, this man parks in an open spot along a yellow curb with a red meter. He took the existence of the meter to mean that he could park as long as he paid. And as you see in the video, a stranger walks by and, noticing that we're all confused by the meter, clarifies that the space is for a six-wheeled truck only.
What's the point of it? I don't get it. I don't know. Why would you have a meter here? What's red meter? There's a 30-minute limit on it. I mean, I got 30 minutes. You will get a ticket at the... It doesn't make any sense. It's red. It's for 6 wheels or more. Ah.
Yeah, so I mean, we were confused about, well, if it's yellow or if it's red, why is there a meter there? But apparently, the loading trucks are supposed to pay for stopping there, unless they have a certain commercial sticker, in which case they don't need to pay. But it's not, and we talked to a parking officer about one of these yellow zones that had the parking meters, and at that Arrowhead truck that was 1.5, are they supposed to pay for 2 spots if they take up? And he said, yeah, they're supposed to pay, but it's not like he expected them to pay. So yeah, it wasn't terribly clear. Even though these San Francisco meters are the best we've seen, where it's really easy to see from far away, from half a block away, you can really see the color, which is better. New Orleans, everything's yellow. It's hard to tell. Yellow could mean loading, it could mean it's okay to park, or it could mean no parking. Okay. Then this last clip we're going to show here, this is, as we started to look more beyond just meters, that we saw that parking signs themselves were very confusing, and there's a lot of opportunity to design. As a designer, I see, parking signs are really not very well designed. We could do a better job. So here's.
Third, the meaning of the signs was often hard to understand because they were used inconsistently, or they conflicted, or appeared to conflict until you read the small type, which is of course hard to do while driving. For example, the sign on the left indicates there's no stopping from the sign to the corner at any time, but the sign on the right indicates you can't stop in either direction from 7 to 9 a.m. except Saturday and Sunday. So that implies you can stop after 9 a.m. on weekdays, but the left sign says you can't anytime.
Sometimes the layout of the signs make them hard to interpret quickly. These signs indicate that from 7 to 9 a.m. this is a no stopping zone. Then from 9 to 4 p.m. it's a no parking zone. And then from 4 to 6 p.m. there's no stopping again. It implies that you can park after 6 p.m., but this isn't stated.
Thinking about these signs, we realize that most parking signs are written from the point of view of restrictions, what can't be done during which times. But people want to know what they can do now. Signs would be easier to understand if they were use-oriented instead of restriction-oriented. That is, they should focus on what people can do and when.
For example, the previous sign could be written more like this, organized by time of day and indicating what can be done whenever some parking activity is allowed. This sign is confusing because it says no stopping at the top, but then says it's a 10-minute passenger zone below. You have to look closely to see that no stopping refers to the street cleaning period on Tuesdays and Thursdays. This one has a similar problem, except it's even harder to know who can stop or park when.
In many places, there were so many signs it was hard to make sense of them. In this region, you can park behind the signs from 6 p.m. to 8 a.m. on Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, and Sundays, and from 6 p.m. to 12:01 a.m. on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. In the residential zone, residents can park all day, and those without a residence sticker can park for 2 hours, but no one can park on Tuesdays from 8 a.m. to noon. Oh, and buses can't stop here at all. You got all that?
Okay. So I hope that gives you a flavor of the kind of findings that we had and also how we use the podcast to communicate the ideas and try to be a little bit entertaining and engaging in how we presented it. So from the ACS's perspective, these worked really well. We forwarded them on to ACS, and they ended up forwarding them around to other divisions and other departments within the transportation, and then they ended up showing it to clients. So they were off making a pitch to New Orleans, and they showed them part of the podcast that we did back here, and because that was just easily available for them to do, they were able to show it. And then New Orleans said, "Oh, that's really interesting. Can you have your ethnographers come out and do a study of our city?" So that really worked for them. And they also they asked us to make short, like little 2-minute versions of them for the big parking conference of the year. It's called IPI. So they have this giant booth at this conference, and you can see here those monitors up in the front had videos, had some videos from the podcast that people could just walk up and play them there. So they sort of featured this as part of their booth. So they were very happy with the way that the podcast worked for them. And we were very happy as ethnographers because I'm sure all of you have experienced where you go out, you do your research, you come up with interesting findings, you present them to people, and then people say, "Oh, well, that's obvious." And then you end up having to educate people about this concept of the hidden obvious, which is things that are obvious only after they're pointed out. There's a lot of obvious things out there. The question is, which obvious thing is the one you really need to pay attention to when you're designing something? So in this case, we kind of had the opposite effect. There were people around Park who we hadn't sent the video to, but it had gotten forwarded onto them, and then people would come up to us in the hallways and they would say things like, "You know, I've been living in Palo Alto for 20 years and I've never noticed how they stagger diagonal and parallel parking," which is something that we pointed out. I don't know how many of you have noticed on every street on University, there's parallel parking on one side diagonal on one side and parallel on the other, and then you go to the next block, diagonal, parallel on the other. And they do this to make it, because it's so much easier to do diagonal parking, at least every other block, it's easier to move in and out. And I've been living here for 30 years and kind of noticed how it wiggled, but I never really thought about, oh, why are they doing that? So another person came up to us and said, "You know, I never really understood what the different colors meant." So instead of this sort of, well, yeah, you're pointing out things that are obvious, instead, people were seeing, you know, things that should have been obvious to them all the time have not been. And we think, you know, maybe that's partly because parking is so accessible to people, but we think also it was because of the way it was presented. So we felt like, okay, we've pushed past that barrier, at least in this case. And we think these podcasts work because they were short, about 15 minutes. You could watch them anytime, anywhere. You could forward them on. And like I said, we tried to make them as entertaining as we could. And we're going to close with just a few examples of some of the most entertaining clips that we came up with.
So as Ellen mentioned, this is downtown Palo Alto, and you know, the design of downtown has some unintentional consequences, and now that I'm giving you this information, when you're dining or you're walking downtown, you'll notice this. People have a great amount of difficulty parking. These curbs here, no one can see really as you're parking because people can see these trees and these curbs here. So people have a great amount of difficulty getting in the spot. And to complicate things more, it's a really busy street, and so you get really stressed out because A, you're embarrassed that you can't park, and people are waiting. So a lot of people give up. And if you're dining outside, just do your own little survey, or you end up parking literally like this. And you know, So what's going on here? You know, I think we all do it and we all see it happen. I mean, every time you're driving down the street looking for parking, it's always on the other side of the street, and it's really dangerous because we do the illegal U-turn in order to get it. So that's something that made us really think of what we could do. So of course, you know, you back up, and this person even drove onto the curb here, and then continued to park. So we really we got a kick out of downtown Palo Alto. So that concludes our talk. If anyone has any questions, you can contact us at these emails. And we have a paper. Great.
Just wait for the mic.
Can I ask the first question? Julie, thank you. So you were studying New Orleans, you said, has a lot of sprawl. Is that right? And of course, much of the Bay Area is sprawl, and so that's why we have to accommodate cars and make it easier for people to use cars. San Francisco is a little bit more dense, and of course, a city like New York is much more dense. As I was listening to this, I was thinking of David Owen's book, Green Metropolis, that makes the point that in a city that's dense enough to support mass transit economically, the right thing to do is to make it harder to park and harder to use cars. Close lanes, take parking away, just because the more you accommodate cars, the more congestion there's going to be. I realize that probably wasn't part of your study, but you maybe have some comments on that.
Well, one of the goals of, I think, demand-based pricing and a lot of these things is to make the price of parking more transparent and to encourage people to, choose other options. So I think that is within the realm of the designer's goals, is to get people out of cars and into public transportation.
Yeah, one of the things they don't say about the demand parking, when they said, you know, you can extend the amount of time that you can park, what they don't say is that the longer you stay, the price ratchets up. So it's escalating. So yeah, you can stay for 3 hours, but you're gonna pay a lot more. So, and that Donald Shoup, his thing is the high cost of free parking. That's his whole case, is that the more you accommodate it, the more you get this sprawl. And you know, a lot of those requirements of how many parking spaces you need for different kinds of businesses are not based on any data. They're just sort of lore, and they tend to choose them for the maximum amount of parking that you might need on the worst day of the year. So, you know, they're even the requirements that there are encourage it because there's just too much parking provided.
I'm Susan, and I've been a long-time ethnographer. I've lived in 11 American cities, wow. And as you were talking, I was rifling through trying to figure out which one would be the most fun for you guys to do, and of course Boston was totally at the top, which makes me think that now that you've done a few locales, and some of your work has been passed around and you possibly would go to other places, do you really think that going to other cities is going to give you truly differentiated data for each city? At some point it sounds like surely you're going to come to some generalities.
Yeah, I would imagine so. I mean, I don't think we're there because New Orleans really surprised us a lot. It was the first one out of California, so I think probably Boston we would learn a bunch more. But you're right, at some point, I mean, it's kind of like the usability testing, right? At some point you start seeing a lot of the same sorts of things, and then you get the oddball, interesting thing that sparks an interesting idea. But I'm not sure we're there yet, actually, yeah.
I think it also depends on who the client is, and I think for cities themselves, cities have a certain culture, and it's very unique, and somehow parking is influenced by that. So I think the findings could be interesting in some cases with regard to that, but I think parking in general can be generalized among cities, but I would think that studying parking in Boston, for example, would gain some interesting findings.
And probably international. I mean, as I said, ACS is trying to go into international cities, and it's probably, you know, different sorts of cultures that it would be worth looking at, yeah.
So you mentioned that keeping the video short was a good thing, and you mentioned 15 minutes as being the magic length of time. That seems like an eternity to me. Will people really watch a 15-minute video?
They did. I mean, people really kept coming up to us and saying how they really liked them. And also, the other thing that surprised me, I don't know James, but they kept saying, oh, the production quality was so high that it seemed like, like we were figuring it out as we were going. Sort of, we're not video editors, but, we got a little better with each one. So, I don't know, maybe because parking people have opinions about it and they care about it and they want to tell their own story about it. I don't know. It seemed, I'm sure, we don't know who stopped watching, but certainly there were plenty of people who did.
I think in some cases I agree with you, 15 minutes does sound like an eternity, but if I were to give you a 40 or a 70-page ethnography report, or you had the option of maybe sitting at your desk and watching a podcast, maybe the podcast would be preferable.
But it seems like I wouldn't learn as much in a 15-minute podcast as I would from a 70-page report. Did people, right. Once people had seen the videos, were they more in the reports, or was the video for them?
I think they go with the video. I mean, it's kind of like they don't read the report, so at least they get something, and they get a flavor for the kinds of things. And then for some people who did, the people who were really core to the project, they were really interested. But if you're trying to get the executive interested and excited and willing to invest or something, it's a great way, and even if you only show 5 minutes of it. And we found that, like I said, ACS wanted us to create the 2-minute version and the 5-minute version, and so maybe that's something we'll start to evolve, is to have different lengths to show for different audiences.
You mentioned in your talk one of the problems was with the idea of the changing colors on the sidewalks. The engineers weren't too, thrilled about that. I guess it was a technological problem. Just in your estimation of the different cities you've gone to, how much of the barrier to a, ideal parking system, or at least a better one, is due to just the technology isn't there, and how much of it is due to things like just institutionalizing, this is the way we do things type of thing? What's your sense of that?
Well, there's a lot of bureaucracy in the parking and regulations and laws and things about that. But actually, when we went to New Orleans and we presented this to the New Orleans parking officers, I was actually fairly impressed by how well they understood what they were doing with parking. I mean, a story he told about in the French Quarter, parking is horrendous. There's just no parking, and it's a problem for the residents. So they actually they started to require people to pay for parking on Saturdays, which they did, he claimed, not so much because of the additional revenue, but what that did was it meant that the residents no longer could just park their car on the street on Saturdays, so they had to get garage parking, right? They had to start paying for the parking, and then they would put it there on Sunday too, so that opened up parking on Sundays for tourists. So, I mean, they were very aware of what they were doing and, and the incentives that they were putting in place. But it's not like, right, these things don't change quickly, and, these are big, slow-moving organizations.
Let's have one more question while Marika puts on her, sets up her computer.
Yeah, you were bringing up a topic about how, for example, like the businesses in the French Quarter, how across, or New Orleans, that the parking garage across the street was making plenty of money, and they didn't really care at all about the situation was bad because they were making plenty of money from it. And I guess that your customer, your client, is actually pretty much the city, and ACS, I guess, is sort of I'd say the specialist that the city is hiring to actually implement it. Is that sort of how it's working?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I get the question.
I'm just wondering, what are really I can see that the incentives could be very different for a parking lot operator or for a department that, let's say, the revenue gets structured based on how many tickets they write, or a city that's interested in having tourists or merchants that want customers to come in. Where do you fit in all of this?
I see. Okay. So right. So we're helping ACS, and ACS goes and pitches to municipalities to manage their parking, and they really want to do. There's this balancing act, right? They want to help them gain revenue, but the cities also are very aware. New Orleans certainly makes a lot of their revenue from tourists. They want it to be a friendly place. So there's definitely that balance there. It's not like they're just about making revenue. Like I said, that they did the Saturday parking not so much for the revenue, but to make it easier for the tourists. So there's definitely a balance there. Yeah. Okay.
Go ahead.
Our second speaker is Marika Reibsperman, and Marika's spoken twice at BOSS before. It's the first time she's speaking to the general meeting, and she told me before at dinner that she just stopped working at Cisco 10 days ago, and in 10 days she'll be starting at Motorola. So this is a chance to hear her understanding resistance to change.
All right, thank you for coming in and sticking around for a little bit longer too. I'm going to try to not make it a horribly late night for you. But I did have some thoughts about change that are a little bit different, I think, from what we usually think about in the context of Silicon Valley. Here, when we think about change, we typically think about how to make it happen faster, how to make innovation routine, how to get who will adopt fastest, and how to deal with laggards. And we might even worry about things like how we ourselves can become more agile and more nimble and more flexible, and how we can make our teams that way. And in that particular mindset, I think what we're typically getting is something that Alvin Toffler announced a long time ago, that the future is going to belong to those who can unlearn. That is, people who can adapt really well, as opposed to in the past, the future belonged to people who could read and forget reading. It's now being able to change. And what I think that breeds sometimes is a general feeling that of this macho sort of needing to stay with it. If you can change, you're really something, without necessarily thinking all that much about what the changes are. I think we're still in a general mindset of sort of equating change to progress. It certainly equates to profit, right? Innovation must be a good thing, and I have become interested over many years of sort of thinking about what people do when they undergo change, and have started thinking that there is sort of an opposite way of thinking about change that doesn't necessarily look through this corporate lens, and that there are lots of actually more interesting things to learn about change that are much more fun and counterintuitive. So I want to share a few of those things with you today. In the first place, I'd like to start actually is if we're thinking about change from the perspective not of sort of growth and creative destruction and profit and capitalism and and us participating in it, if we think of it more from the inside out, about the labor of adaptation, the experience of it, then there's not a whole lot of work in the technology field that I'm familiar with, but there is some literature in the medical field that's very instructive. What I put up in this slide here actually is from the life changes scaling. In the medical field, there's a general understanding that if you were to be able to figure out how much stress people under, you would then be able to make some predictions about how likely adverse health events would be for them. So there is actually quite a bit of work in the medical field to try to weight changes. And what I find really fascinating about that is, if you look here, is that it seems that it's rather counterintuitively that it's not the valence of the change that matters. What seems to matter is something different. So for instance, look at an outstanding personal achievement in the original ranking from 1965 was in 25th place, and it's sort of equivalent to trouble with in-laws. It's just about as likely to make you sick. Clearly, I would choose outstanding personal achievement over trouble with in-laws. regardless of what my immune system might have to say about it. But there's some things, there's a piece here about the benefit of a change is, and may be independent of other things that happen with the person who is trying to adapt to a change. There's lots of other things that are interesting about life changes scaling. One is that things are getting more stressful rather than less so over time. Like in 1995, the average LCUs for this whole list of things is 49, and it used to be 34, right? There's all sorts of other things to learn from here, but mostly what I wanted to look at here is that benefit and the experience of change can be completely independent from each other. And there's other really counterintuitive things that I've run into more recently as I was just running pretty old-fashioned usability studies that made me think of this life changes scaling. So I was doing some usability testing for Cisco, where I just finished up, as Paul said. I worked on WebEx, actually. What I was testing for now, I want to skip over, and I would like you to look at some subjective assessments of the general ease or difficulty on a 5-point Likert scale from very difficult to difficult, neutral, easy, very easy, by 2 groups of users. And the numbers here are very small, but what is really striking is that novices, the green folks, thought that this one feature we showed them was easier than the people who had experience. And that sort of goes counter to what I usually assume in usability testing, and I wouldn't say it's always the case, but once I started looking, I found more instances of this. If you already know something, then seeing something new may actually cause problems. So again, this is, let me show you what this was about. This is WebEx. I don't know if you've ever used WebEx. You might find this particular dialogue, either one of the two, familiar. But the folks that we had in our study had never seen the one on the left, and that's the one they saw. So the novices obviously had never seen it. They'd never seen anything. And they got through it pretty well. This dialogue allows you to connect up the telephone when you're already connected via the computer to a WebEx meeting. And you need to be able to talk to the folks who are also similarly connected to the meeting, right? So what the dialogue at left allows you to do is just put in your own phone number, and then you hit call me, and the system will call you back, and you get conferenced in. The dialogue on the right was the one that the users with experience had seen before. So they came in with a mental model that said, I'm going to call in on the phone, and I'm going to find this phone number there, and then then I will step through all these other steps I'm used to doing, and then I'll be all good. And what they saw instead was the one at the left, and we got people who started doing all sorts of very interesting things. Some folks actually said, oh, let me try this. So they got connected using the computer, which is a fairly hidden feature and ordinarily is not much used. And they later explained that that was because they really didn't want to deal with the thing at the top, so they found a way around it. We got some people who tried to find this phone number and put it where it said enter a phone number. Right? They're trying to recreate the experience they've had before. And that is why, those kinds of things, really the confusion that resulted when they didn't see what they saw before, they said, well, it's either difficult or neutral or easy, but it wasn't easy or very easy the way it was for people who'd never seen anything and just followed instructions, right? So if you never see anything, like the thing on the right before, you look at the one on the left, and you say, okay, well, I'll put in my phone number. And that was pretty easy. So this is not the first and only time I've seen something like this. Here's another example. Also WebEx, happened almost exactly the same time. We're looking at a prototype and I've mocked it up here because I couldn't lay my hands on that old prototype right away, but what this shows you here, the screen capture, shows you the usual WebEx home screen where you end up when you originally connect to the meeting. And on the right of that, you see the names, and if someone turns on video, or lots of people turn on video, the one video screen is shown immediately above. And I asked the question to two groups of users, one experts and the other group was novices with no experience or very, very little. What if they wanted to see everyone's video at the same time, what would they do? And the people who'd never seen this before, just when, I don't know if you can see it, it's kind of smallish in this thing, but it says there's a button over here in the top right on the video area that says View Everyone. So all novices just said, well, I want to see everyone at once. I click that button. That's not hard. The people who had been using WebEx a lot couldn't do it. 4 out of 5 just couldn't do it at all. Looked and looked and looked and said, well, I guess you can't do it. I don't know how. Gave up. Except for one who figured it out after some difficulty. So when I asked them what that was, what happened, right, when I said later, at the end of the study, I said, did you see that button that says View Everyone? And they said, sure, I saw that. What do you think it would do? They said, well, I thought that was going to make it so you couldn't see the names anymore. There's something in the WebEx, the version of WebEx that they were familiar with, that's like a toggle where you can make the list of attendees go away and you can bring them back again. That's what they thought it was. So both of these examples may be fairly isolated. I can't give you a good idea of how often it happens that people are looking at some small change in an interface and they say, I don't know what to do, and yesterday I knew what to do, right? But I suspect, before we sort of make any conclusions about the implications of this, I suspect it happens a little bit more often than we usually give ourselves credit for. So before I try to say anything else about how often it might happen, I'd like you to think about sort of change in general, the whole universe of change. And imagine that the largest circle here is sort of what I'm calling universal change, is the change that biology and physics make happen, right? It's the subject to the second law of thermodynamics. It's growing older, it's sloughing off, it's wearing out, it's breaking, it's just all of the other unfortunate consequences of things that we're trying to resist as much as we can, that are just in our environment, right? And then I drew in some little circles for human change, intentional change, things that we are making happen as sort of a way to stand against all of this change that happens even if we do nothing else, right? And I think in the usual narrative of Silicon Valley innovation, the innovations and the improvements, and I'll talk in a moment about why I have both of those little circles there, but in the usual narrative of what innovation means, that those two little circles are sort of our stand against this very unfortunate effect of everything to really go bad all of the time without us even half trying anything at all, right? But that what it leaves out is the possibility of drugs that actually make you sicker. It leaves out possibilities of innovations that do not necessarily benefit humanity as a whole, like gunpowder, cannonballs. There's innovations that aren't necessarily and only positive, but I don't want to concern myself with those too much. I think that's part of life, but there's another whole realm of change that I'm more concerned with, because it's the kind of change that often is invisible to us. It happens all the time. like here, a little pimple on the innovations, and a larger area in the improvements probably of changes that actually happen to us, not because we sit around and say, I really would like a new smartphone, or my neighbor has got this really fabulous device and I think I want one too. These are changes that happen to us because we've made a prior decision to establish a relationship with a purveyor of technology of one sort or another. These are updates, upgrades, bug fixes, patches, versions, service packs, all sorts of things that actually happen there that share some characteristics with all of the change in the larger universe of change that is actually to a large extent not chosen or even choosable by us at all, right? That sometimes you might try to shut down your computer because you're in a hurry to go home, and it turns out that you're out of luck because Windows is very busy updating, and forget it. If you're going to shut down your computer now, we just won't know about the consequences. Could be pretty bad. And stuff like this happens a lot, right? We get updates on lots of devices. Hardly a day goes by without some kind of an update, right? And stuff happens with these updates that is fundamentally different from what happens with the innovations that, for instance, diffusion studies have talked about traditionally. Like Everett Rogers, for instance, in Diffusion of Innovations, talks about an essential activity in dealing with innovations is the information gathering and information processing activities that precede a decision to adopt. When it comes to upgrades, we already have a prior decision, and once you've got that relationship with whoever provides the technology to you, basically presumes that when it's time to update, you're going to do this because your decision is not whether or not you will adopt something, it's really whether you will adapt to the change that is being provided by this company you already have a relationship with, or you'll abandon altogether, which probably would involve more upheaval and more work. So you're kind of stuck in lots of cases. The choice that you might be presented with when, for instance, on your Android phone it says, ooh, there's an update, you could say, well, I think I won't do that. I don't want it. But most people realize that they're going to be out of luck if they don't accept the updates and the upgrades. Or when it comes to, for instance, there's other clever ways in which people can make it unattractive not to upgrade, like go to a new version of something. And typically, what happens when we're accepting an update is a number of things. We're not really choosing necessarily, right? We're in some way accepting that we're not as free to choose as when we originally chose a product, that our hand is forced, the deck is stacked. So one of the things that really happens with an upgrade is that there's a piece of resentment in the whole experience. Someone is probably already not so happy as when they go out and make a purchase, just because the sense of empowerment and autonomy is being undermined by the update experience. Something else that happens is that you typically have very little information about what happens with this change. You are told you want to upgrade or not. The question is yes or no. Do you have other information about what you are doing? On your Windows machine, you might have some way in which you could accept, 8 out of the 9 changes. You might not want all of them, but do you have time to go do the research to figure out why it is you might want one and you don't want another? You're not being presented with the information right there, for sure, to make an informed choice. So it's sort of like, okay, all right, I'll go for it. And people, one of the things that happens is I've done a lot of interviews once I sort of I started thinking about what happens with change, and I started talking to people about their experiences with change, is very interestingly, when a change is forced on them, they often say things like, they start to infer some kind of a malicious motive. They are, for instance, on the Android phone, they did the upgrade and everything became horrible and terrible and my phone got slow and it was terrible, but then they changed the little thing on where you pull up your menus, and you used to be able to tap it and now you have to, or you used to be able to drag it and now you have to tap it or something. Something changed over there and they did that just to make me feel better about it. That make it feel like the upgrade was worth it to me somehow. Or people talk about Facebook. One day you log into Facebook and all of a sudden your messaging system is changed. All sorts of things might change on any of your cloud applications. You have no choice. It's just there. You might be participating in an A/B experiment for all you know. You're not asked. There's no consent form. You're just participating in it, and you might have lost something that is important to you. You might be presented with changed functionality. You might get something new and beautiful, but people tend to say, oh, one person actually gave me this quote. It said, it's not user experience on Facebook, it's advertiser's experience. Right? There's an immediate thought that if you just sort of make people accept these kinds of changes without giving them a choice, that you're doing something terrible to them. And it makes them think about their own disempowerment, makes them think about how they're actually cogs in a very large machine, and on Facebook it makes them think about the fact, well, of course, I'm not paying for anything, and the people who are bringing in revenue, of course, are being accommodated. Now, what I think happens is much of the time we, as designers and as researchers, as UX people in general, we're very well-intentioned and we might be making improvements. And we're probably thinking they might be improvements, but we don't necessarily know exactly what the impact is on people, and we're not necessarily aware of the fact that there's other people in the company who are putting the whole end-to-end user experience and all the touch points together, right? When I was a designer or when I was doing work as a researcher, I wasn't always aware of how the releases and the updates were actually diffused to people. It fell beyond my purview because I was busy on the more glorious aspects of UI design and good experience, and we didn't always keep an eye on what happened with all of the user touch points. Now, once I started talking to people about and soliciting examples of good experiences and bad experiences in upgrades, updates, and any of those things, what turned out to be the case is that people can give you some examples of really good changes, like, for instance, the change from command line interfaces to GUI interfaces in AutoCAD, for instance, in drawing programs. And they can come up with examples like Autodesk, which actually did a really smart thing by providing, in addition to the command line interface, also the GUI. So now you had a choice. So for people who were used to the command line interface, who said, well, it was still quicker for me to just type the commands that I knew, they were not being forced into a change. Right? The choice was up to them whether or not they were going to go along with the new interface or whether they're going to stick with the old one. And those are basically the examples that I've been able to come up with from all of the examples, and I've talked to a couple hundreds of people about all of the examples of changes. For the most part, changes are not nearly so well received as the move from command line interfaces to GUIs, whether it's in AutoCAD or in Windows, for instance. What I hear much more about is people remembering, and remembering very vividly often, those experiences where they got hit with an update and some functionality was taken away, like the messaging system in Facebook. For instance, on Facebook, at one point you were able to send asynchronous messages to anyone, and then they changed it, and now you can send asynchronous messages to people who are not online, but the folks who are online, you can only send a chat to. There is no more asynchronous communication to people who are currently online. And the message inbox has been changed from basically based on an email version that allow people to sort of archive and search in ways that they're used to as an email, and it went to a different paradigm. So those kinds of the mental model changes, they are very painful for people. Even when they say it's a good system, like on QuickBooks, for instance, the latest upgrade on QuickBooks, it's really good, but it took me months to get used to the way in which they did X, right? That's very vividly remembered. So even if there is a benefit in the change, that doesn't mean that it comes across as a benefit right away. Can take a long time before it comes across as a benefit to established users. And then probably the very worst types of changes are the changes that are exemplified, for instance, in the changeover to Office 2007 with a ribbon. I'm pretty sure that for first-time users, the ribbon probably tests better than the old menu model, for instance. But for established users who knew how to do what they needed to do in the old version of Office, right, all of the Office products, they ended up spending a lot of time having to relearn on top of routinized actions. So if you were using PowerPoint or Excel, you typically knew by heart what it was you were going to do the things you usually do, and you wouldn't have to think about it. You pulled down the menu, you knew where it was, and you just did it. Might not be a very salient experience, but once that the ribbon was introduced and all of the actions were reclassified, what people knew was where it used to be and not where it now is. And it apparently takes a while. It takes maybe five tries or 10 tries or 15 tries before someone has relearned the new one. And the old one could have been completely random. The new one is probably still pretty random. It could be better, but people experience it as worse than the old one, because the second time around they have to unlearn first and relearn on top of something that's already routinized is a lot more work than learning the first one the first time. So if you're going to reclassify things, you better make damn sure that it is thoroughly and totally intuitive, and that you don't do things like, for instance, they have done in Office 2007, and provide a few things that you can insert into your documents that are not in the Insert tab. People will become positively vitriolic for anything that's random the second time around, where they never complained about it the first time around. This also suggests to me, by the way, that it's really important to get your classifications right the first time around. That some things you might be able to change later on and say, oh, well, it's just a first release and I'll change it later. But classifications are probably not among them. They're really hard. Now think about keyboard shortcuts and other shortcut changes, mouse changes, things that your hands knew to do, that your brain doesn't consciously get involved in. If they change those, For instance, in PowerPoint, Control R used to be related to the drawing functions. Now Control R pulls up the review panel, the review pane. If you're used to hitting Control R in order to group your drawing elements in a PowerPoint slide, then your hand is going to do that for you many times before you remember that, damn it, you're going to get the review pane when you do that, right? Those are very, very painful change to have to adjust to. Position changes are similar. If I'm used to having the home button to the left of the location bar in Firefox, and all of a sudden they stick it over on the right, it might take me a while to learn to not look over to the left when I need to hit the home button, right? It's just some things are really painful. So what does that mean? What are the implications? I think in the first place, for me as a researcher, putting myself in front of the end-to-end user experience to really get a better understanding of all of the touch points with people in the way that changes are diffused to folks through existing relationships is really important. And it's not very sexy. It's much sexier to be in some of the other parts of the research life cycle, the design and development life cycle. But it's really important to get an understanding of how whatever product you might be working on really what it means to those people who have their hands on it all of the time. And another thing I learned is to always make sure that I have both established users and novice users in all of my participant panels, because much is to be learned from the difference between those two perspectives. And third, to fight for disclosure and communication. There is probably nothing as infuriating to people as being told to do something without adequate information, or not being told to do something, but being invited to make a choice with no basis to make that choice. Would you like to update now? Maybe. But where would you even go to find out if you want to do that? It's experienced as an insult, and it makes people feel powerless from the get-go in a really negative way. Now, there's also something to learn for designers, right? To design for transition, to design for things that if you're going to change it, somehow the interface has to disclose that it's changed. Don't leave someone hanging who says, well, it used to be able to do this, that, and the other thing, and doesn't do it anymore. Well, it turns out you can still do it, you just have to do it differently. But how are you going to teach people that it's now changed, right? You didn't just take it away, you just put it somewhere else. And so that kind of disclosure to help people through a transition is really important. And then, of course, is to avoid things like if you've got keyboard shortcuts, leave them be. Reclassifying things, be careful. There's all sorts of things that you can do that in principle might be good for new users, but you have to think about what the impact is on established users. And then I think the other things that I take away from this is if you don't want to be evil, then you really have to be very, very well informed. You can't just say, well, I'm working on a great release, and there's all sorts of things going on in there that other people are taking care of that you don't know anything about, right? It's like, are you really, in order not to be evil, you have to really understand what it is you're doing to people. But then thirdly, what I take away from this is actually, for me as a user, to think about the stories I tell, the way I think about how we live with this kind of change, how we participate in the universe of rapid technological change. Are we telling ourselves stories like, it's really important to just learn to adapt, or be a Luddite? Or can we tell different stories? Can we tell stories that don't just make that opposition of either it's like adapt or perish, or adapt or step away, Can we tell stories that really think differently about what changes are appropriate to agree to, and where our power lies as users? It may be true, of course, that Facebook users are not paying for the service that they enjoy. It's the advertisers who are have all of the money flowing into Facebook coffers. But there are millions of Facebook users, and if they weren't there, there would not be any advertisers either. There has got to be some power in that. And so what I would like to do last is just invite you to give me some thoughts about what you think about that as designers, as researchers, and as users yourself.
I have a question there. I think there's a name already for what you're talking about. It's called the assimilation paradox.
The assimilation paradox? Tell me more about that.
That's exactly what you're talking about. The effect you observe with WebEx.
Mm-hmm.
That when you improve something, quote unquote, it's tougher for new existing users
Yes.
to figure out how to do it than it is for new users. And I think that, I mean, it even has a name on it. So it's interesting that you have come to this conclusion. It validates things that I've heard before.
Okay.
And what, so you say investigate the impact of changes. How would you do that? Through, say, usability testing, or just field research, or just...
I think it would be a combination of usability testing before release, but also follow me home studies to get a better understanding of not just what we create in the lab, because what we create in the lab is entirely artificial, right? We pick and choose. We say, okay, well, we're going to test this. There's all this other stuff we're not going to test. There's lots of aspects of the overall experience that we don't test, but that we can find out with follow me home studies. There may be an established principle like the assimilation paradox. I'm very happy that you're alerting me to it. But what I think is not happening is I don't see much effect of an assimilation paradox in our design practice or in our research practice. There's not much alertness to that as a possibility.
Thank you.
Hi, Marika.
Hi, John.
At Blue Shield, where you and I got to know each other, I was doing a project where it became for something that was going to be used by specialists internally. It was an internal tool, and so it was a very small number of people who would be using it. And they had a tool that was really awful. And in order to do anything, they had to go to 5 different programs, 3 of which were DOS, and it didn't even occur to them that this was not optimal. And they were so proud of how good they were at it, that it made me really wary of making changes casually, just because it may be better in some ways, but it's going to be harder for them, and it's going to tick them off. And I wonder if you've noticed any correlation between resistance to change among specialists on something who use something all the time, and people like with Facebook or Word who may use it often, but it's not really their shtick.
You're touching on something that's really important, I think, and it's when any change is made for existing users, the old interfaces becomes obsolescent, and their expertise becomes obsolescent, right? Obsolete, I should say. So. Rapid obsolescence doesn't just throw out a lot of old technology. It throws out a lot of human knowledge and competency, and that is obviously stronger with people who have learned things through dint of much effort. But I think it's one dimension of the changes that are really difficult to adapt to. is an awareness of having had an expertise that you now have lost, right? And having to relearn. But it's also true that experts tend to be a little bit more willing to put the time into the tools that they use. So there may be something that offsets a little. For more casual users, people who, for instance, if you're using the Office suite for much of your work, you're not really thinking of yourself as an Office expert, right? They're just a tool, and the tool should be transparent. You want to get your work done, and the work is not to learn those tools. So anything you put in the way of people for whom the tools should be transparent is experienced as a very heavy cost, because and you can put a new system in front of an expert, whereas experience is part of their work to learn the new environment. So I think it much depends on exactly how that is presented, because whether there is a choice in that and whether there's an involvement of the experts in the whole process of change can make a big difference. But I think there's a lot of really more casual use where the cost is experienced as a lot higher, just because the people are not willing, in principle, to spend any time at all on just maintenance of their competency with the tools.
I have a question about experts. If you did any study or any research with experts who may work with one another using the same tool, and in different kinds of environments where they might have been willing to help one another or didn't work together, because I did a long ethnographic study for my dissertation, studying physicians as they navigated the transition from paper record to an electronic health record. And I found that in different types of contexts and different types of environments, the culture in which they worked really affected the ways in which they navigated that change, which was doctors who tended to work together in more collaborative or more collective type of environment navigated that change very differently than doctors who were very isolated in their work environment or were combative or antagonistic with the administration and the people who were doing the implementation. And that also affected the ways in which they viewed the change, the way they navigated the change, and the way they perceived the change. So maybe experts saying, it's not just you're throwing this change at us, we don't, oh my God, it's just everything is horrible and it's just everything's gone to crap and the thing I used to do is bad, but turning to their colleagues and saying, okay, can you help me learn this? Is that something that you also see people doing?
I see that actually a lot in synchronous collaboration tools. Like anytime someone's using WebEx and they say, oh, how am I supposed to do? Someone else will say, oh, you go to such and so menu, right? They will not use, like the inline help, for instance, they'll rely on each other primarily. Whether or not people in any given work environment will work together depends a little bit on what kind of tool it is. I had one study involving a performance management system upgrade from just using Word documents that everybody uploaded into a central database to using I think it was Oracle, which was a horrible interface and nobody could figure out how to do any single performance management record, and they could also not write in there once they had figured out how to do it, and they couldn't review the document with their direct reports in there. And that is something that that they were basically not willing to work with each other to learn how to do it, because it was perceived not as it's part of my job and I should learn this. It was perceived as HR undertook a big brother effort, right, so that you could track better what I'm doing, even though the old system involved tracking too, right? It was basically perceived as just more monitoring and not essential to the work that they were doing. So as an insult to the fact that they were already very busy, and they were not about to go work together to try to figure out how to do it together. So I think collaboration can be a very powerful tool to get people through changes. I've also seen this with intranets, for instance, where the administrative assistants typically are very good at using those kinds of tools because they have developed techniques for dealing with them, and then they teach everybody else how to deal with it. Those situations, you see people being willing to, or very apt to say, oh, I've got someone I can ask, and you see that quite a bit. But it really depends on the nature of the tool and whether or not it's perceived as your work.
I'm wondering whether this adaptation difficulty that you talk about could be mitigated with an evolution of searchable user interfaces. In the old days when we designed websites, we put a lot of work into designing the you're talking about the categorization or classification. We put a lot of work into setting up that navigation model, and now the navigation model is almost irrelevant because everybody just puts everything into the search engine. If, using your Microsoft Office analogy, if I can't find the table border tool, I want the table border tool, and the interface was designed to show me where all the features were. Do you see that moving in that direction?
I don't really think so. Well, maybe there is a way, there certainly is opportunity for inline help to improve and to get around these bizarre descriptions of where something is, which often you have to study for half an hour before you properly understand how to get to where they're telling you to go. I think there's a lot of room for improvement there. But I think what an interface like that would not accomplish is helping people do things by rote, right? Just, you know where it is, your eye goes straight to it and your mouse is on it right away, or it's under such and so menu, it's in this tab. Those kinds of things really is the fact that you would be given, if you were given a tool that would help you get past all of a sudden not knowing where things are, it would help you through the transition, but it wouldn't, I think, go very far in helping people reestablish the kind of rote operability that they're looking for.
Thank you very much for your talk. Something interesting that your talk reminded me of was in another speaker's talk. Once I heard him talk of a concept of on-ramping, and this is kind of something for discoverability of changes on top of things already known. For instance, as you spoke of root memory for where things are located in menus, you'd have alongside that a shortcut so that when the experts are going repetitively to that item in the menu, you could also see then the shortcut key command paired with that, which is not in the way but gracefully is kind of just there for learning. I was wondering if you had been familiar with this on-ramping concept or could talk anything towards it as a way for discoverability of change?
I think that it's especially helpful for first-time users, right, where you do whatever you do to figure out which menu your thing is or which tab whatever it is you're looking for. And then you have an opportunity to gradually discover that there is a shortcut for it. Now, some people never discover the shortcuts, and other people get very good at shortcuts, and some folks are amazing at how many hundreds of shortcuts they actually know. Like, for instance, for all of the Mac programs that they're in the Mac environment and the Adobe products, the whole thing, like, they seem to know them all by heart, and they're perfectly willing to relearn them every time the changes are made in them. But I don't know that they are very helpful in getting people through a sudden transition where they're used to having something work in one particular way, and they're not even thinking about how to do it. They just, your brain says, oh, this is how to do it, and now it doesn't work anymore, right? It just, the action is not in the same menu. Or, for instance, you might still be in the menu. I think it was in 2003, the menus in the Office suite became dynamic, so that the things you did most often would show up at the top. Well, that's a nice idea, of course. I mean, it's sort of a way to help people get to their actions faster. But what a lot of people said to me was, I used to know exactly where everything was in the menu. I could pull the menu down, and I knew exactly where my mouse was going to go before the menu came down. And once they started moving about, I was lost, right? So I think for a lot of these things, I I'm not sure that they would help with transitions from one interface to a changed interface.
Right, so what I'm hearing is maybe sudden changes should be avoided, but more iterative steps or smaller steps might be more amenable to change. For instance, instead of the item automatically going to the top, presenting the ability to move items that you frequently use with a more passive way, incrementally, as opposed to a sudden drastic change. Is that true?
I would think that would help a great deal, that if you give people the ability to move things to where they would like them to be and then make it predictable where it's going to show up. At the same time, it tends to be really high-end users who customize interfaces. Right? That is also true. So I'm thinking that there may be ways to design for transition, to disclose, to make sure that there actually is sort of periods where things are in both places, like what Autodesk did in the AutoCAD programs, where rather than replace one thing with another, you actually have, at least for some period of time, you have both interactions there. Would probably, that gives people an opportunity to discover that there may be a better way in their own time. And maybe they don't discover that, but certainly for AutoCAD, that was, for the AutoCAD programs, that was a very graceful way for people who were used to command line interfaces to sort of ease themselves into the GUI, where they said, it was more work to have to move their hand to the mouse and to do the commands with the mouse. For those they knew by heart, they would still type them, but they gradually sort of moved over. And I think that is a much more promising avenue to design for transition.
Hi. First, I think the term that you're looking for when you're talking about knowing things by heart or just doing without thinking is muscle memory.
Yeah.
So I would add that to the list of,
yeah,
the negative changes that are hard to overcome.
Mm-hmm.
And second, I've been seeing this more recently, like in Gmail and Facebook and other sites, is that when they push updates and changes, they do this little like sort of stepped walkthrough, like previewing of features. It's almost as if you are a new user again, and they kind of have to sell you those features and reorient you, maybe re-educate you in that sense. So I think part of the issue is that training and maybe helping people overcome the muscle memory is you could have games or like little ways to get people to retrain their muscle memory like over and over again, kind of like if you play an instrument, like you have to learn, like relearn those steps as well.
Possibly. But yeah, it depends on the environment, I think. It seems to me that if you're building a game into, well, actually, I'm thinking about Tetris. You remember why? Remember Tetris was introduced, I think, to help people learn to use the mouse in the Windows environment. I think I'm not. Minesweeper, maybe. The games were introduced to help people get used to the mouse, and that I think that there may be opportunities to do things like that, but there's a big difference between a tool like Facebook, where people go for entertainment, I assume, in principle. I know there are people who use Facebook in a more work-related context, but there's I think would be a lot more resistance to that kind of training through games for things that are more work-related, that where particularly I think for actions that are likely to be done under time pressure, that would not at all be appreciated. It sort of depends, I think.
I think that we've been through a couple of interesting transitions recently. before the Android App Store and the Apple App Store, we didn't carry around these devices and have updates pushed to us quite so much. We had security updates pushed to us, but we didn't so often have functionality and user interface changes pushed right to a device that's so personal as a mobile device. And that's only been, what, a couple of years, really. And then there was a time maybe 7 years ago or a little bit longer when we didn't have web apps that got refreshed overnight, and we'd arrive at our favorite web app and find that the user interface had changed or a feature had changed or something like that. Before that, we got updates from Quicken only if we chose to buy the update and only if we got the CD in the mail.
Right.
Is this a phenomenon that has accelerated and is partly responsible for why we perceive stress more greatly now than a few years back? Is this just sort of a natural side effect of the world accelerating on us?
I think it is much more common than it used to be. That is definitely true. It's partly, I think, that there are more and more, I think, updates are being pushed to us without our involvement. That is, I remember the time when I was gracefully asked, would you please do something or other so that you would get updated. Now I don't get asked a lot of things anymore. It just happens. We have more devices. We have more software proliferating. All the apps that we didn't used to have. Definitely, I think it's speeding up, and I think there's also a general. I remember a time when if I upgraded, I got a message that said, "Thank you for upgrading." You get messages like that now. There's a new paradigm, I think, for how this happens that worries me a lot about just how people are willing to participate in the cycles of technology renewal, where it seems that on both sides of the fence, we've sort of companies are finding ways in order to make us do the updates or undergo the updates without really giving us a choice to do it. And we seem to be more and more just resigned to it. It's like, okay, here you go again. All sorts of things might result when you don't know what it's going to break or what you're no longer going to be able to do, or what you don't know anymore how to do. But we just sort of submit in ways that I think have changed also. And there are times that I wonder whether that actually generalizes to the way we are in the world in a larger way, whether we're just more sort of willing to undergo, whether it's we're traveling and we're stepping through the various kinds of equipment that the TSA subjects us to, and all sorts of things. I think that our own willingness to just do it seems to be changing.